The auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Global Summit 2030, held in Geneva, had gathered presidents, senators, CEOs, and journalists under one golden ceiling, and not one of them expected to be challenged by a man from Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the marble stage without a teleprompter, without a script. His brown uniform, the same he wore during the revolution, looked out of place among tuxedos and tailored suits. But it was his presence that quieted the room, not his outfit. In the front row sat Senator J.D. Vance, arms crossed, flanked by European diplomats and defense consultants. The moment Traoré was introduced, Vance leaned toward a Dutch minister and whispered, "This should be entertaining." Traoré didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch. He looked out across the sea of eyes, polished, wealthy, confident, and saw one thing in common: they weren't used to being questioned. Finally, he began. "You say this is a summit about cooperation. But what you really mean is control." That sentence didn't just ripple across the room, it cracked through it. "I stand here representing a continent that has been told what to do for 100 years. First with chains. Then with banks. Then with speeches about democracy while drones flew overhead." J.D. Vance rolled his eyes. "Here we go," he muttered. Traoré paused, locking eyes with him. "Some of you built fortunes on minerals taken from children's hands. Some of you call that progress. I call it theft." There it was, the line that pierced the room like a blade. Vance raised his hand. "Mr. Traoré," he said with a smug smile, "with all due respect, the West built the modern world. Roads. Electricity. Trade. You're welcome." A few polite laughs echoed in the back. Traoré didn't flinch. He walked to the edge of the stage, pointed calmly at Vance, and said, "You built it with stolen bricks. You built it with blood. And now you wonder why we're not applauding." A hush fell. This wasn't a speech anymore. It was a reckoning. The moderator, a former NATO diplomat with decades of calm under pressure, cleared his throat awkwardly. Let's keep the discussion constructive," he said, looking nervously between Traoré and Vance. But the fire had already been lit. Senator J.D. Vance leaned forward into his microphone. "Mr. Traoré," he said with a grin that barely masked his irritation, "you speak about theft and blood, but let me remind you, the world doesn't run on slogans. It runs on systems. On order. On rules that work." He raised a finger. "We built those systems. We sacrificed for them. And the reason your countries struggle isn't because of us. It's because you refuse to adopt the structures that bring prosperity." A few murmurs of agreement rolled through the crowd. A CNN camera zoomed in. Social media feeds lit up. But Traoré remained still. Almost too still. He wasn't reacting, he was choosing. Then, without notes or hesitation, he replied. "You talk of rules. But whose rules? The ones that say a nation can't build a dam unless the IMF approves it? The ones that say a child can't drink clean water because a mining company owns the river?" He took a step forward. "Your systems were designed to keep you rich. To keep us dependent. You call it order. We call it a cage with marble floors." The room shifted again. A few journalists glanced at each other. The tension wasn't just ideological, it was generational, civilizational. Vance's jaw tightened. "Without the West," he said coldly, "your continent would still be in darkness." That was it. Traoré turned fully toward him. "You say you brought us light?" he asked, voice low but sharp. "No. You brought fires. You brought coups. You brought presidents in coffins and generals on your payroll." He paused. "And now you're angry because we stopped kneeling." Gasps. Audible ones. The moderator signaled for a break. But no one moved. Eyes locked. History had entered the room, and it refused to be silenced. After the moderator forced a short break, the delegates filed into side rooms for coffee and damage control. But the real storm was in the air, and online. Clips of Traoré's last line, "We stopped kneeling," were already trending in a dozen languages. Backstage, J.D. Vance paced near a cluster of U.S. aides. His jaw was tight, his hand twitching slightly with every notification buzz from his phone. One aide approached. "Senator, we need to steer this back. If Traoré keeps hijacking the narrative, the summit becomes a platform for anti-West propaganda." Vance didn't answer. He was staring through the curtain at the stage, where Traoré was now speaking quietly with a young South American president. Both were laughing. That bothered him more than it should have. Across the hallway, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't laughing out of amusement, it was strategy. He knew the break gave them time to regroup. He was gaining allies, not with money or deals, but with clarity. With truth. And that was the one thing empires always feared. Inside the press room, a reporter from Al Jazeera asked, "Mr. Traoré, do you feel safe criticizing the West so openly on their turf?" He smiled slightly. "When you come from a country where children drink from poisoned wells because their gold was exported to Paris, fear is a luxury you lose early." Flashbulbs popped. Meanwhile, Vance was drafting a counter-speech, something sharp, laced with policy stats and GDP figures. But something in him knew numbers wouldn't save the day anymore. Traoré wasn't speaking to balance sheets. He was speaking to a world that had grown tired of being told what progress looked like. And that scared Vance. Back in the main hall, the moderator called for the next session. As Vance walked toward his seat, he noticed something different. No one was smiling at him. Not the African ministers. Not the Asian delegates. Even some Europeans looked hesitant. The empire's smile was cracking, and Traoré had done it with words, not weapons. When Traoré returned to the stage, his calm presence contrasted sharply with the tightening face of J.D. Vance. The moderator, clearly rattled, tried to frame the next question around development partnerships. But Traoré ignored it entirely. "I want to show you something," he said. He held up a folded sheet, an old map, torn at the edges, yellowed by time. As cameras zoomed in, the screen behind him projected a digital replica. "This," he said, "is the Berlin Conference map of 1885. A room of white men in suits divided a continent they had never seen, carving borders with rulers and greed." The room tensed. A few delegates shifted in their seats. Traoré continued, "They drew borders that split tribes, united enemies, and handed resources to foreign companies with European flags. That map was not drawn with ink. It was drawn with blood." Silence. Then he turned toward Vance, who now had his arms folded tightly. "Senator Vance, you say you built the world. But what you built began with stolen names, erased languages, and markets flooded with charity wrapped in chains." Vance responded, trying to cut through with numbers. "Yes, borders were drawn. But look at the aid numbers. The U.S. provides billions in development assistance. That money builds roads, clinics, infrastructure." Traoré cut him off. "Clinics where our doctors use expired medicine. Roads built by foreign contractors paid 10 times more than local engineers. And when our people rise, your banks freeze our accounts." He paused. "You offer us help like a man offering water with one hand and tightening a noose with the other." There were no claps. No gasps. Just a heavy, sobering quiet. Because what Traoré had done wasn't emotional. It was forensic. He wasn't shouting. He was building a case, and every word landed like a blow to a system used to applause, not accountability. Outside, crowds were already gathering. African students holding homemade signs. Latin American activists live streaming the debate. In Accra, Nairobi, Caracas, people weren't watching a panel. They were witnessing a reckoning. J.D. Vance had faced protests before, loud, messy, passionate outbursts that he could dismiss with rehearsed lines and patriotic quotes. But this was different. What Traoré delivered wasn't a protest. It was prosecution. Cold. Precise. And it was working. The moderator tried to salvage the panel. Senator Vance, would you like to respond to President Traoré's points on resource extraction and financial pressure? Vance nodded stiffly and stood up. He began confidently. Let me be clear. The United States doesn't steal. We invest. We support stability, growth, and opportunity across the developing world. Developing for whom? Traoré asked flatly. Vance faltered. What? Developing for whom? Traoré repeated. For the corporations whose stock prices rise when our governments sign away lithium, cobalt, oil fields, and farmland? The audience murmured. Vance's eyes narrowed. We bring transparency, Vance began. You bring consultants, fine print, and penalties hidden in page 73, Traoré said. You offer contracts written in your language, enforced in your courts, and secured with your military. That was the moment Vance snapped. This is absurd, he barked, voice cracking. You think we're the enemy? We're the reason your countries have power grids. Clean water. Access to medicine. Traoré leaned forward calmly. And yet, Senator, you never ask why the grids still fail, why the water remains scarce, why the medicine runs out, unless there's a photo op. Gasps now. Audible. On the side screens, someone had pulled up an infographic, U.S. aid versus resource extraction. It wasn't flattering. Vance looked at the screen, then at the moderator, and then at the crowd. He was cornered, not physically, but morally. This wasn't the debate he'd expected. He came to preach order, but found himself defending a history written in margins and footnotes, and Traoré was reading it aloud. Backstage, aides scrambled. One whispered, we need to pull him out after this session. But Traoré wasn't done. He looked across the room and said quietly, empires are never aware they're collapsing, until they hear the silence where applause used to be. Outside the conference hall, the real storm had already begun. The video of Traoré confronting Vance was clipped, subtitled, and flooding the internet within minutes. On TikTok, a teenage activist in Nairobi edited the moment Traoré said, developing for whom, over a montage of collapsed wells, rusted-out schools, and neon-lit Western Bank headquarters. It hit 10 million views before the debate even ended. In Johannesburg, protesters marched with signs that read, "We built the world you looted." In Paris, student groups flooded embassy gates chanting Traoré's name. In New York, journalists buzzed through the press lounge, scrambling to rewrite headlines. The narrative had shifted, from aid to accountability. Back inside the UN chamber, J.D. Vance sat stiffly, eyes forward, face pale. For the first time in his public career, he wasn't sure what camera angle would save him. The moderator's voice trembled slightly. President Traoré, many critics say the U.S. presence in Africa is stabilizing. That without American involvement, nations could fall to extremism or economic collapse. Traoré stood slowly. The same critics once said slavery brought civilization. He let the words hang. He walked to the edge of the stage, not behind the podium anymore. When you tie your neighbor's leg and call it support, you are not helping him walk. You are making sure he never outruns you. Silence. A dangerous, thinking kind of silence. Then, applause. Reluctant at first. Then rising. In the control room, UN technicians zoomed in on Vance. He looked like a man made of wax under too many lights. Someone handed him a bottle of water. His hand shook. Meanwhile, the U.S. delegation sat tense. One aide muttered, "We underestimated him." Backstage, a veteran African diplomat turned to a young colleague. "They came expecting a sermon," he said. "What they got was scripture." Across the world, news alerts pushed out. Traoré challenges U.S. narrative at Global Summit. J.D. Vance confronted on history of exploitation. Africa no longer silent. And outside the building, the crowd chanted now with rhythm, unified and loud. "Never again. Never again. Never again." J.D. Vance leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady but forced, like a man clinging to the last piece of driftwood in a rising tide. "I understand the emotion in this room," he began. "But we cannot rewrite history with slogans. The United States has invested billions in African development, in infrastructure, education, healthcare. We built schools. We built roads." Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't even sit. "Mr. Vance," he said slowly, "you built those schools with our timber, our labor, and our silence. You paved those roads to your mines, not our markets." A murmur swept the chamber. Vance continued, "But without Western partnership, what's the alternative? China? Russia? You think they care about democracy?" Traoré raised his hand. A signal, not for silence, but for attention. "Democracy?" he said. "Let me tell you what democracy looks like to a village in the Sahel. It looks like drone strikes with no names. Loans with no mercy. Lectures from men who've never planted a single crop or buried a child under a collapsing aid tent." The room froze. Then Traoré walked closer to Vance, not threatening, just towering. "Calm. And by the way," Traoré said, his voice quiet now, but each word sharpened like glass, "when you speak of democracy, remind me who built the cages?" The question landed like a hammer. Whispers exploded across the room. The reference was unmistakable: the migrant detention centers at the U.S. southern border, the children in foil blankets. Vance's past defense of harsh immigration policies. He had walked into it. For the first time, the moderator interrupted. "Let's maintain decorum." But it was too late. The spell had broken. The crowd wasn't watching a panel anymore. They were watching judgment. A Ghanaian delegate tweeted a single line. He reminded them who built the cages. It trended globally within 15 minutes. Backstage, a senior U.S. staffer turned to her colleague. "He's not playing to us," she whispered. "He's playing to history." Outside the conference hall, a storm had already begun. Traoré's question, "Who built the cages?" was clipped, translated, subtitled, and shared across 5 continents within the hour. News anchors replayed it like a penalty kick in a World Cup final. TikTok teens remixed it with trap beats. Former detainees from the U.S. at Mexico border posted reaction videos, eyes glassy with recognition. But the impact wasn't just cultural. In Washington, a senior advisor to the State Department muttered under her breath, "He just turned the narrative upside down." Meanwhile, inside the UN chamber, J.D. Vance sat stone-faced, staring at the polished wood of his desk. He had come to deliver a message of Western leadership. But Traoré had flipped it: leadership, yes, but not Western. Traoré, still standing, now addressed the room like a professor dismissing the final illusion of empire. For too long, Africa was seen as a charity case, a continent of hands outstretched. "But look around you now," he said, gesturing toward the delegation rows, "we are standing. Not because you lifted us, but because we stopped waiting." The room listened. "We build our roads now, not to your ports, but to our villages. We grow our crops, not for your aid agencies, but for our children. And when you ask what system we want, we choose no master." Someone began to clap. Then another. It grew. Traoré didn't smile. He wasn't looking for applause. "We remember the Berlin Conference," he added. We remember the theft dressed as treaties, the trade routes soaked in blood. You can call it civilization if you like. But we were already human. Backstage, a tech from a major news outlet whispered into her headset, "We're staying live. This isn't a speech anymore, this is a movement." Vance finally spoke, not into the microphone, but to his aide beside him. "He's not just talking to them," Vance muttered. "He's declaring independence, from us." The aide didn't respond. He was already tweeting the quote. The White House Situation Room was not amused. By the time Traoré's speech reached its emotional climax, the U.S. delegation had already received 3 urgent calls, one from Langley, one from Brussels, and one from a private donor with too much money and too many mining contracts in Africa. "This isn't just a speech," said CIA Director Helena Marks. "It's a blueprint." J.D. Vance, still seated in New York, received a discreet vibration on his phone. A message from an anonymous intelligence contact flashed across the screen. "Your boy just lit a fire under every neo-colonial arrangement left standing. Get in front of this, or lose it." Back in the UN hall, Traoré had taken his seat, silent again, but the silence was strategic. The buzz around him wasn't just admiration. It was power, raw and unfiltered. Dozens of delegations now whispered in their native tongues, not about NATO or China, but about Burkina Faso. And a question emerged. If they could say no, could we? Later that evening, as the marble floors of the UN emptied, Vance found himself in a quiet room with Ambassador Reid, one of America's top diplomatic operatives. "He thinks this is over," Reid said, sipping cold tea. "But we're just getting started." "What do you mean?" Vance asked. Reid tapped the table. "Soft power didn't work. Time to pivot. Sanctions. Disinformation. Maybe even stir a little civil tension. Nothing permanent, just enough to make him need us again." Vance didn't answer right away. The irony burned. "He accused us of stealing the world," he said finally. "Now we're planning to steal his momentum." But Traoré wasn't idle either. That night in Ouagadougou, in a quiet room guarded by revolutionaries, he met with leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea. They weren't here for ceremony. They were here for strategy. Traoré unrolled a map. "We build one corridor," he said. "West to east. No French oversight. No IMF signatures. Just us." A former minister looked up. "They'll fight us." "They already are," Traoré replied. "But let them learn something new, we don't need to fight back. We just need to build forward." 2 days after the debate, the clip of Traoré's reply to Vance had been translated into 42 languages and viewed over 120 million times across platforms. It wasn't just a moment. It had become a movement. Across the global south, activists began quoting him on banners. "We didn't inherit freedom, we reclaimed it." And in classrooms from Sao Paulo to Dar es Salaam, young students asked a dangerous question: what if he's right? In Washington, however, the tone was shifting. Behind closed doors, J.D. Vance was brought into an urgent National Security Council meeting. "He's not just defiant," said one advisor. "He's persuasive. We're losing not just control, we're losing the narrative." Another chimed in, "Even some of our own allies are holding off on joint statements. They're waiting to see how this plays out." Vance sat silently, staring at the table. "He said we stole the world," he muttered. "And they're believing it." At that same moment, Traoré was addressing a crowd of tens of thousands in Ouagadougou. The sun blazed down, but no one moved. His voice echoed through the dusty air like thunder. "They told us we were poor. But they meant we were uncolonized." Applause. "They told us we were unstable. But they meant we were ungovernable by them." Roars now. "They told us we couldn't lead. But here we are, leading not just Burkina Faso, but a vision. He raised a small bag of soil. This, he said, is not just dirt. It's not just our land. It's our proof that we are enough. Somewhere in London, a retired colonial officer turned off the TV. In Paris, an oil executive called an emergency board meeting. In New York, a Wall Street investor asked his analyst, should we diversify away from West Africa? But for Traoré, the only question was, how far can we go before they try to stop us again? As the crowd erupted in chants, a reporter asked him backstage, are you afraid? Traoré smiled, not cocky, not defiant, just sure. No, he said. Because I know something they forgot. You can steal a resource. You can even steal a generation. But you cannot steal the will to rise. The camera panned up, the crowd waving flags, the dust catching the sunset, the drums of resistance echoing through the city. And in the very last shot, J.D. Vance, watching it all from a screen in a secure office, the reflection of Traoré's image burning in his glasses, silent. The world had shifted. Forever. J.D. Vance said it loud, we built the world. But Traoré didn't flinch. No, he replied. You stole it. And in that moment, history cracked open. This wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. A clash between illusion and memory. Between those who wrote the books, and those who lived the truth. Traoré wasn't speaking just for Burkina Faso. He was speaking for every silenced voice, every stolen resource, every nation told to wait its turn. And now, the world is listening. Not because he shouted, but because he stood. Not with threats, but with clarity. Not with hate, but with conviction. The story doesn't end here. Because somewhere, another leader just realized they don't need permission either. So now we leave you with one question. Who really built the world? And more importantly, who gets to build what comes next?